about financial capitalism and why it works, and then we will head into questions.
Okay, so maybe I should start with the term capitalism. Capitalism is a system of free enterprise. It's a system where the economy is directed by markets rather than from the top down. So markets means the interactions of buyers and sellers, consumers, producers, and intermediaries, middlemen. Whereas from the top down means typically the government controls what gets invested in, what gets produced, what's available to consumers. And so the big choice is between whether we have a system where it's millions of people contributing to the market economy and versus one where it's from the top down that the direction comes. So a crucial question is, who decides where finance goes? Who decides what businesses get invested in, what products get produced, how they get marketed, what features they have, what prices they have? And in a system of capitalism, those features are not determined by any one person or any central planning committee. They're determined by the interplay of millions of people. So finance refers to a system of allocating resources to the productive sector. So what goes on in financial markets are lending and borrowing, people swapping present dollars for promises to be repaid in the future. There's also risk swapping that goes on, but let me focus on the trade between present stuff and future stuff. People generally value present resources more highly than future resources. And so they pay a premium to get present resources. That premium we call the interest rate. If you want $1 today, you have to promise to pay a little bit more than $1 next year or the year after. And the fact that the interest rate is positive, pretty close to zero nowadays, but usually positive, basically comes from the fact that people are impatient. And so if you are more patient than most, people will reward you for that patience. If you give them dollars today, they'll give you more than $1 per dollar next year. How high the interest rates are depends on the interplay of the market, supply and demand. As a first approximation, at least if we leave the government out of it, the supply of funds comes from households that are saving, mostly saving for retirement. And secondly, it comes from businesses that have retained earnings and have to decide whether to plow them back into their own business or whether the opportunities are better in some other line of business. And the main demand for these funds comes from businesses that are borrowing to finance investment. So if you want to build a factory, you need to hire people to build it and you need to buy the materials to build it before it gets going, before you have any revenue. So you need dollars today, in exchange for which you can promise dollars tomorrow out of the revenue that the factory will earn if it goes well. So capitalism in financial markets means free competition among savers, free competition among borrowers or investors, and free competition to be intermediary institutions that bring together savers and investors. So free markets means no barriers to entry, no price controls. We allow innovation. We don't protect old firms against upstart firms. There's no too big to fail policy. That's what a free financial system looks like. It works well for savers because it means various intermediary institutions, banks, mutual funds, insurance companies are competing for their savings. There was a service whose slogan was, "When banks compete, you win." And that's right, you get a better deal. When you can choose among multiple banks and other options, mutual funds, stock markets, bond markets, for placing your savings. You can shop around for the best combination of risk and return that's right for your situation. right? So one size doesn't fit all. One savings plan isn't the same, isn't right for everybody. So as a consumer, as a household, you want a wide variety of offerings, and that's what capitalism brings you. For investors, if you're, well, capitalism means the freedom to start a business, but freedom to finance a business without requiring the government's permission. Right? In the old Soviet Union, you couldn't just start up a business. Where would you get the money? The only bank in town was the government-owned bank, and if they didn't like what you were doing, they wouldn't give you the money. So everything was directed by the party. But in the capitalist system, you don't have to convince the one bank in town. You can shop around among multiple banks to lend you money. And if none of the banks think you're worth taking a chance on, you can go to venture capitalists. You can go elsewhere trying to find just one person who's willing to be your angel investor. And if you can do that, then you can get off the ground, and then the market will tell us whether your investment idea was a good idea or not. So competition gets entrepreneurs the best funds on the best terms and the most options for financing their enterprises. The way the funds get from savers to investors is either directly through the stock market or the bond market. Right? Some savers will go to initial public offerings and buy shares of stock, but more commonly, it goes through financial intermediaries, that is, firms whose business is to gather up savings and then decide who to lend them to. So banks do that, mutual funds do that, pension funds do that. And the reason people prefer them to directly choosing their recipients, the ultimate borrowers of the money, is that the intermediaries gather information on who's a good credit risk and what kind of default record they have, what the probabilities of them paying back are, and how different industries' patterns of success vary across from industry to industry. Because as a saver, you don't want to put all your eggs in one basket. You want to diversify your funds. The second thing that a bank or a mutual fund will do for you is diversify the pooled funds across many investments so that if one firm fails, you don't lose all your money. It's only a tiny fraction of that portfolio that the bank owns or that the mutual fund owns. I don't know if any of you have seen peer-to-peer lending sites. That's a kind of new alternative. But you can go to a website that says, here's a list of people who have signed up with us who want to borrow your money to start their own business. This guy's got a pizza parlor. This lady has a daycare center, and they want to borrow money from you, and here's the interest rate they're offering, and you decide whether you want to save with them. Well, it's kind of risky. You need to do some research, and if you put all your money into one business, there's a risk that you end up with nothing. You avoid those kind of research burdens and those kind of risks by diversifying, by using banks and mutual funds. So that's what they do for you. And banks, so I can stop there. I just wanted to emphasize competition is good for the public because they get better rates. And competition isn't just among banks, it's among banks and other intermediaries, between traditional financial firms and decentralized financial firms. Upstarts like peer-to-peer lending sites and like cryptocurrencies are also part of the broader competitive process. And we need competition to discover for us which are the best ways of doing business. Okay, I'll stop there.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Dr. White. That was very informative. And okay, so now I'm going to ask you elementary questions for the youngsters in the audience. Free enterprise, freedom to compete. We were talking about Adam Smith, watching the different bakeries, and he watched the people that the different bakeries would compete with one another, and they'd put their signs and they would have the lower prices for the biscuit, and so then they got all the customers. But it was freedom to compete. Why does that have such a bad name now? And I think so it's ironic. and yet, if we have socialism, it would be interesting to kind of walk through socialism a little bit. We're going to talk about that next week, so not in great detail, but it takes away the multitudes of organizations. I mean, I'm always fascinated in a simple way of going to the store and I want peanuts. All the different kinds of peanut, manufacturers. You have
Right.
Jiffy. You have what's the other one?
Skippy,
Skippy, right?
Smuckers.
Jellies. We have so many. I go now of shampoos. We have so many things from which to choose. And I always think, well, why does this person think they're any better than that person? But the consumer is the one who fleshes that out. And because there are so many, the prices have to stay regulated. Whereas if you have one shampoo or one peanut or what, that's controlled by one entity. That's all the only choice we get. And those prices are going to be high, and we may or may not even get a good product. I was in communist China in the 1980s, and I watched how the lack of competition prevented people, and the lack of freedom within the financial institutions kept the people from being able to buy things and have choices, a multiplicity of choices with things that they wanted. Very austere, very austere. And yet, people think free enterprise is kind of not cool and not nice. So, and that socialism would be better. And some people even think communism, where the government controls everything and tells you what you can and cannot do and cannot make, and it's one price. Why is that? Why are we up against this problem today?
There are a variety of reasons people are skeptical about the good that capitalism or free enterprise does. They usually don't say free enterprise because that has a kind of positive connotation, but they say capitalism because that has a negative connotation. That's a term that Karl Marx popularized as the successor to monarchism, which is for the benefit of monarchs, and feudalism, which was for the benefit of the feudal lords. He thought capitalism is a system that only benefits the capitalists, the rich, the business owners. But if you read Adam Smith, you know that that's the opposite of the truth. It provides the most benefit to the people of the most modest means. They're the ones who really need freedom to shop around, to get a good deal, to choose among products, as you were saying, and to have options among different businesses that are trying to serve them, because one kind of peanut butter doesn't serve everybody. In financial markets, there are concerns not only that these firms are just too big, they have too much money, but that somehow consumers aren't able to choose for themselves. And so we need experts to narrow down their choices for them. And if you try to get a mortgage, although thankfully you can shop around, it comes with pages and pages and pages and pages of disclosures and that you have to sign, you have to read through and sign. You need to hire a lawyer to do that for you. Banks are restricted in all kinds of ways about the products they're allowed to offer. Banks are not allowed to compete with insurance companies, and banks are not allowed to compete with investment banks, and vice versa. And all those restrictions act to the detriment of consumers. But sometimes they're supported by businesses that don't want to compete so hard. It makes life more comfortable if they're, just serving a particular niche and don't have to worry about competition from other new firms, upstart firms, treading on their turf. But as far as sort of socialism or communism goes, people have a kind of romantic view about how if things are run by experts at the top, everything will be decided in a healthy way, in the right way. There won't be so much noise in the system. But of course, the people at the top don't know what you want, and they're not likely to get it right. And so, as you were saying, the actual lived experience in countries that are run by central planning boards has been terrible.
Well, not only do they not know what you want, they're going to tell you what you want. In communist societies, if they get to choose, and they're the only entity that gets to fund these organizations or provide you with what you get at the grocery store, they're going to choose for you what you can, not only which product is best, but what you can and cannot even have. So that I've witnessed that firsthand in China when I was there. So
there's more consumer choice in China now than there used to be. Last time I was in China, there were Kentucky Fried Chicken restaurants everywhere. But in the financial system, it's extremely controlled. There are 4 commercial banks in China, and they're all owned by the government. So if you are a business, say you're a real estate developer and you want financing, you have to go to the government-owned bank. And so you have to sort of you have to provide what the government wants rather than what consumers want.
And if you said something that the government doesn't like that you said, they're certainly not going to give you any money. Or if you're not behaving the way the government thinks you should behave, they're not going to. I mean, so many things come into play. It's not just, oh, we don't think your government is your idea is good. It's like, what kind of citizen are you before I'll.
That's right.
And by citizen, I don't even mean whether just a good person or bad person, but are you abiding by the rules we're telling you?
Are you towing the line?
Yeah, it really does exist. It's not just a fabrication that we make up over here. It really does exist. Okay, Tova, your turn.
Well, great. Thank you so much. This is really fascinating, and it's a good look at, our financial system. So I was wondering, looking towards the future, what would you say the future of capitalism in America is? Do you see it gaining more prominence, like becoming more capitalistic and free? Or do you see the government taking over more control and it becoming more like socialist form of enterprise?
It's hard to say. So far, the US is one of the countries with the least in government-owned enterprises. So we don't have government-owned commercial banks or government-owned mutual funds. We do have the Social Security system, which is a government-owned pension system. By the way, it runs in a way that wouldn't be allowed if a private firm tried to do it, because it's making promises that it doesn't have the funding for. But we're in this constant race between innovators who find ways to do things creatively before there's a rule against it, and the regulators who are trying to bring everything under their control. So we've got some innovative financial products now coming to us from the cryptocurrency sphere and from traditional finance, but applied in new ways. Securitized lending. So loans can be chopped up into little bits, and the bits can be sold to lots of investors. And that's turned out to be a pretty good idea. We also had some other experiments in fancy financial products, collateralized debt obligations, which kind of blew up during the last financial crisis. So we learn by trial and error. But as long as people will insist on there being space to innovate and space for entrepreneurs, the market will survive. It's possible to hem it in to the point where innovation slows down. And I think we see that in some countries in Europe. But Europe actually has a reputation for restricting enterprise that in some ways is undeserved. I mean, if you look at, there's a ranking called the Economic Freedom of the World Index. Some countries like Sweden actually have quite a free market. They have high taxes, but you have a lot of choice. Businesses are free to operate. In Sweden, they even run the educational system on vouchers rather than the way we do it in the US, which is monopoly local public schools. So in some ways, they have a more competitive economy. So if we can borrow some ideas like that, I think there are lots of places where we can make the economy more competitive and better for consumers.
Thank you. And then what would you say the role of government is in a capitalistic system? Is government involvement always a hindrance, or do you think there's a role for it at all?
There's certainly a role for preventing people from stealing and preventing people from defrauding each other. And so there's kind of that core protection of property rights and contracts role, which we assign to government. But when it goes to the point of restricting people's options, restricting their freedom to make mutually agreeable bargains, something that doesn't involve victimizing anybody, when government steps into that role, then they're starting to restrict the freedom of the marketplace.
Thank you. And then, so we've kind of seen a trend where there are kind of very large, lucrative companies being formed, like Facebook, Amazon, or like big media conglomerates. Do you view this as threatening capitalism, or is it actually a benefit in capitalism, or kind of a natural end result?
I don't see it as a threat. Yeah, if you don't want to have a Facebook account, don't have a Facebook account. So nobody's being coerced. Now, Facebook took over from MySpace, which was an inferior version of Facebook. So in that sense, it's an improvement. Now, I may have views about what Facebook should do or shouldn't do, but at least I have the freedom, if I don't like Facebook, to move my discussion somewhere else. So I am on Facebook and I'm on Twitter, but I'm not on TikTok or other social media platforms. You have to pick and choose. The consumer is ultimately sovereign over what Facebook can do. They do have a certain amount of discretion because of the dominance they have, but if they make the wrong decisions, then their business goes down the tubes. So they have to be careful to keep consumers happy.
That makes sense. And then how does globalization affect capitalism? As basically markets aren't limited to a local area, they can be global now. How does that affect the way capitalism plays out?
Globalization is great. It means that you have choices not just from local producers, but from producers all around the world. So it's important, especially in industries where there are economies of scale. You don't have 100 car companies in the United States. You have 3. We get more competition by allowing in imported cars and not putting high taxes on them, tariffs. And so that promotes better choice for consumers, lower prices for consumers. That's all to the good.
Great. And then, so how can we do things like, protect the environment or protect workers' rights under a capitalistic system if kind of the goal is to reduce government involvement?
Well, those are big questions. So the environment is a difficult problem because if you have a factory with a smokestack that's putting out soot or carbon dioxide or sulfur dioxide, and that's polluting people's environments, that is in the way like a physical assault. So it's not something that we can just turn a blind eye to. There should be a way for the value that consumers put on clean air, not having their air invaded with foreign particles, have that value register. It's hard to create a market when you have thousands of polluters and millions of pollution recipients. So we rely on some basic rules of legal procedure. If you're invading somebody else's turf, they can bring a suit against you to constrain what you can do. And the same thing applies to workers' rights. There's a long history of legal decisions that have spelled out what workers' rights are. And the most important workers' right is the right to quit the job. And so employers have to attract workers by offering agreeable working conditions. Then that's the best protection that workers have. But beyond that, employers shouldn't be able to bait and switch. They shouldn't, it would be a violation of contract for them to promise the worker one thing and then give them different conditions contrary to what they expected. And then if the worker quits, not give them their back pay. So people should be held to their contracts. That's, I think, the most important protection for workers.
Mm-hmm. And then how does a capitalist system deal with monopolies, or like how should they be dealt with in a capitalist system if the worker might not have the option to quit if they're power plant is the only one in the area, or if a consumer can't, use another company, if that's the only one that exists that's accessible to them.
I think as a matter of fact, those kinds of situations are extremely rare and temporary. The only durable monopolies in our economy are the ones that are protected by the government. So the post office has a legal monopoly of first-class mail. If you ask your neighbors, can I deliver your mail across town for you, you will be threatened by the US Postal Service with jail time. They've actually done this to threaten kids who were delivering Christmas cards because it violates their monopoly. As long as we avoid those kinds of, another important source of monopoly are occupational licensing laws that say you can't braid hair unless you have, 100 hours of cosmetology training. That protects the existing hairdressers from competition by people who don't even want to, know how to use dyes and other things that might be dangerous. They just want to braid hair. So those kind of laws protect existing firms against competition. We need to dismantle those kinds of barriers. And that, I think, will deal with 99% of what people call monopolies. In some industries, you have a single dominant firm because that was the first firm to start the industry. But that kind of situation will erode if that firm doesn't serve people better than anybody else can. You'll get more firms entering when they see that it's a profitable business.
Wow, that's really interesting. I kind of never thought about it like that. And so then I was wondering, what was the system in place before capitalism? Was America always a capitalist country, or was there kind of an evolution to where we are today?
That's a good question. So if you go back to, people sometimes associate capitalism with industrialization. If you go back to before industrialization, let's say before 1700, you had market economies, but the most non-market economy you can find is feudalism. So in feudalism, you've got the lord of the manor and the serfs working for him who are quasi-slaves. They're not directed in everything they do, but they have to fork over 25% of what they grow to the lord of the manor, and they're not allowed to leave. But if they can escape to the city, the medieval cities were the big sources of liberty. If you escape to the city, then you're free. Now you have to agree to the rules that the city imposes, but within that, you can do whatever business you want to do. And so that's the beginning of what we call capitalism. The free markets that prevail even before there's industrialization. So the US, when it was a colony, when we had the 13 colonies, they were very much market oriented, but in some ways the market was distorted by the fact that they were under colonial restrictions imposed by Great Britain. So Great Britain wanted the colonies for supplying raw materials to them, but they didn't want the colonies competing with them. So the colonists were not allowed to make nails. Sounds crazy. Why? Because there were nail makers in Great Britain who wanted to sell their nails to the colonies. So that's a restriction on trade. That's an infringement on market capitalism. And the colonists didn't like that. And part of the reason they rebelled was to have a freer economy, to escape from these restrictions. The famous Boston Tea Party was a rebellion against a legal monopoly given to the East India Company to be the only company that was allowed to sell tea in the New World. And the colonists said, we want, free choice among tea providers. We don't want to pay your high prices. And so they threw the tea in the harbor, which was, a little bit naughty, but made their point.
It sure did. And then finally, I was wondering, does capitalism have any sort of social values kind of attached to it that aren't necessarily financial? Like, for example, is it possible to have a capitalistic system in a society that doesn't uphold civil liberties like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, etc.?
That's a very good question, and it's something that people debate about. Sometimes in the guise, what is the social responsibility of a business firm? Do they owe the public anything other than delivering a good product at a good price and making profits for their shareholders? So I think it is very difficult to have a free market system in a country that doesn't uphold civil liberties. You might point to some seeming examples of exceptions. So Singapore has a very vibrant market economy, but it's kind of a one-party government. And it's very strictly ruled. A personal friend of mine criticized the government policy in a newspaper in Singapore, and he was kicked out of the country. So that sort of thing will have a chilling effect, not just on speech, but also on enterprise. You might be reluctant to start a business that would compete with a business owned by the son-in-law of the party leader, for example.
Really interesting stuff. Thank you very much. I'll pass on to the next person, but I appreciate your time.
Sure.
How are you?
Good.
Today? So I'm just a little curious about, let's say, our last decade. Through the guise of capitalism, how do you think the country has moved or hasn't moved, from the 1920s to the 2020s in regards to capitalism, like where on the scale, between, century, between
I knew what you meant.
capitalism and socialism, like how have we moved? Do you think there's been some big movement or not really worth diving into?
I think there's been some big movement. As I said earlier, it hasn't taken the form of government taking over businesses the way it has in some other countries, where they nationalize businesses, either if they're successful because the government wants to profit, or if they're failures because the government wants to protect the jobs. But if you look at the size of government in the economy, in the 1920s, it was on the order of 10% of the economy. And today, if you add together state and local government, it's on the order of 40% of the economy. So that's a big increase. Now, most of it has been in the form of transfer payments. That is, government taxes workers and it delivers checks to Social Security recipients, Medicare recipients, Medicaid recipients. That's the big growth sector of the federal budget. If you look at other parts of the federal budget, though, they've grown a bit. So defense spending is a bit larger, and I don't know, everything else is pretty small by comparison to transfer payments and the defense budget. But certainly government has grown, taxes have grown. And the thing that's not counted by just looking at the government's share of the economy is regulation has grown a great deal. So industries are penned in a lot more by regulation than they were in the 1920s. It's certainly true of the banking system, which is the industry I know the most about. So it's difficult to start a bank. There are all kinds of rules you have to obey. There are all kinds of data you have to collect on the people you do business with and report.
That actually kind of brings me into my next question, because I've been looking at the mortgages and getting big loans like that, and how many things, how many steps there are, and how different each bank is, each loan officer, what they can really do for you. So I'm wondering the restrictions put on banks, how heavy is it? I guess my real question is, how can some banks get you, your mortgage loan when other ones can't, if it seems so restricted by the government? or is it really just restricted more so by the banks personally?
Well, banks will evaluate the credit risk of anybody who applies for a loan, and that's been made more routine by credit scoring, right? So we got these big credit rating agencies that the banks will go to and find out your credit history. And that's the main thing they look at, but they also want to know your income and your income history, how steady has your employment been, those kinds of things. And they'll make a judgment about how risky a borrower you are. They are under rules to report the demographic information of mortgage applicants and who got approved and who didn't. And they have to report the zip code of applicants and who got approved and who didn't. And there are penalties they pay if they're not lending enough back into the neighborhood. But if one bank will give you a loan and another one doesn't, it's because they're making a different evaluation of your credit worthiness. That's the main thing.
Thank you. Go ahead.
But I mean, one measure of the burden that banks are under is to look at the difference they pay between the interest rate on deposits, if you put your money with them, and the interest rate they charge on loans. It's the difference between those two that they need to cover their costs of doing business. And those spreads have gotten bigger than they were in the 1920s. And they're bigger in the US than they are in more competitive banking systems like the Canadian banking system. At least that was the case. Maybe Canada's caught up in the burden of regulation, but that was the case back in the 70s and 80s.
So I have two major comments, and they're very different from each other, but maybe you could respond to them. So number one is we're talking about capitalism, and to me, capitalism is based on the moral philosophy first, and then which economically resulted in the free market system. And it's one that recognizes the inalienable right of property and property exchange. And the greatest evidence for the philosophy being true to me is how well it works and how much better it works than any other system. And while you need that unalienable right of property, you don't necessarily need democracy or republic. You could have monarchy and have capitalism in a sense.
If you have a benevolent monarch.
Mm-hmm. And any other economic system means that you are that you believe that property can be taken by force routinely, because that's the end of any government action. It has to end in force. So someone getting very wealthy in a free market, we're looking at individuals freely paying somehow for some service that person's providing, or now that can be stretched, that language can be stretched really far, but that's about the fast you could say it, that somehow there is money being directed to that person. So when we speak about this person's too rich, or we want to have equality, what we're saying is we want to mandate individual choice.
Yeah, a couple of things. I teach at George Mason University. I had a colleague who unfortunately passed away about 1.5 years ago named Walter Williams. Walter Williams used to say, before capitalism, the only way to get really rich was to rip off your fellow men. You know, be the big boss, be the king, collect taxes. Under capitalism, you can get really rich by serving your fellow men. Right, by providing a service or a good that they're willing to pay for in vast quantities. And so that's a big difference. That means we think about how we can serve each other rather than how we can oppress each other, or battle to avoid being oppressed. It's not a coincidence that the US has a capitalist system and has the Constitution that we have. Right, because our founding fathers used the phrase you used, life, liberty, and property. That was the foundation for our system. So they were inspired by the philosopher John Locke, who said that for government to be legitimate, it has to have the consent of the people. People have to agree that they want the government to do what it's doing in order for the government to do it, to represent something beneficial to the public and not just oppression of the public. And that was the philosophy that Jefferson and other founding fathers took to heart. If we start from individual rights, including the right to property, nobody can take your property. They can only trade for your property if they want it. They have to make you an offer that you agree to accept. And that's a free trade system.
And that
So-
right there, I think, is it's a powerful way of explaining whether we use capital or not. When we see that in the positive, where you have to trade for the good or for the money, and that's the positive. The negative is if you don't have that system, it means it's being taken by force in some way, shape, or form. That discussion, I just think that's the best way to frame the discussion, because it's not really how it happens among people my age or on social media or even definitely not in Washington. And I've watched a lot of Walter Williams before, so it's cool to hear that you were his colleague. So here's the other thing, though, is that I see that our free market, it seems like you said, if 40% is government, it seems like a critical violation. And there's some things we could point to. We could point to the tech privileges given to the tech companies, or we could look to subsidies in many things, from climate subsidies to subsidies even in higher education, moving revenue where it may not otherwise be going. But then there's something we were talking about last week, and since we're talking about financial capitalism, when private banks were given a monopoly over the currency, created a fiat currency, and were able then to engage in fractional banking, and all of this since the Federal Reserve creation.
Okay, I have a different view, but go ahead.
Okay, that's what we comment on. That seems like it will inevitably lead to the erosion of a free market, period. And when you look at things like the second securities market, and you look at the crash of 2008, and you look at what they're really engaging in, and baked in inflation by design, the two ideas don't seem to be one and the same as far as free market and then everything I just said.
Okay. First, I don't think it's true that commercial banks ever had a monopoly of issuing currency. We had a system of competitive free banking before the Civil War. After the Civil War, commercial banks were much more restricted, but the right to issue currency was still distributed among hundreds of banks. The Federal Reserve Act is then passed, and at first, even the Fed doesn't have a monopoly. The commercial banks continue to issue currency. In the 1930s, the Fed was given a monopoly of issuing currency. But the Federal Reserve is not a committee formed by private bankers. It's not owned by private bankers. It's the Federal Reserve System. It was created by Congress. The Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System is appointed by the president and approved by the Senate. Right now, Biden has 3 nominees who are going to be having hearings.
But it is not a government organization.
It is not a government. Sorry, it is a government organization.
It is not. We just had a guy. We've talked about this for a couple of weeks, and no one else on our show said that it was. They all claimed it was private, and we've had all conservatives. So it's kind of strange for you to say that it's public.
Well, read the history. That's all I can say in the time I've got here. But read about how the Federal Reserve Act was passed, and the Federal Reserve System, created by Congress and staffed by government appointees.
But it is appointed by government appointees, but it's not a public organization.
The president appoints. Sure, it is. It's as much a government bureau as the FDA is. Now, there's one quirk in the Federal Reserve System, which is the 12 regional reserve banks were capitalized. They had to be contributed to by private commercial banks, and they are called the shareholders of these regional reserve banks. But they aren't really the owners in the sense that they can't sell their shares. Their shares don't give them voting rights.
No, they're given a permanent share. I mean, just because you can't sell your share
But
doesn't mean that you are not a private entity
look,
with a share in the federal
the
bank.
shareholders do not control the policies of the regional reserve banks. Those policies are given to them by the Board of Governors, and the budgets of the regional reserve banks come from the Board of Governors, who are the political appointees. So it's from the top down. It is not a privately owned system, despite these sort of anachronistic legal labels that are given to the structure of the regional reserve banks.
It's not a private structure in
and-
the traditional sense of a capital, like as if it's a business itself, but it certainly can't be compared to a branch of the government.
It is a
When you're
branch of the
saying that-
government.
When you're saying that regional banks have a share, that the 12 regional banks have a share in it, and then
It's
the policies, whether
purely window dressing. It doesn't give them any control. The policies come from the
that's just
Board of
straight-
Governors,
when you look
who are
at when you look at who the Board of Governors have been and their actions. it
Well,
doesn't
and let me,
add
if
up.
I could just jump in, because we only have 10 minutes left and we had our we've had a few Federal Reserve shows, but maybe we want to,
Right.
I don't want to get too bogged down in this discussion, if that's okay with y'all.
Sure.
Because we have got some great audience questions here. Eric Braverman, first of all, says, best speaker I've heard in economics. Thank you, Dr. White. Will capitalism eventually overthrow Chinese communism or just modify it further? Has Russia been able to transition to any real market capitalism?
Those are both very difficult cases. So China has improved because it's become more market oriented. So ordinary people have a little more freedom to decide where they want to work than they used to. But it's a very mixed system in that many of the major enterprises are owned by Chinese military or owned by the Communist Party, or at least a controlling interest is owned by the party. So there's a limit to, what these firms can do in the way that upsets the government's plans. In the financial system, there's a very effective system of cell phone payments provided by Alipay and WeChat Pay, and the Chinese government can't stand it. They're trying to take it over. So they want to force everybody into their central bank digital currency platform so that they can have better surveillance over the users. So that's the kind of struggle that's going on inside China. It has more freedom than it used to, but the party is still in control. What we can hope is that as people become wealthier, they start to demand more freedom. They start to travel abroad and see how much freedom we have in the West and say, we want more freedom to speak up and to consume different kinds of goods and different kinds of entertainment than what the party chooses for us. In Russia, the move from a completely top-down system to a more market-oriented system, like China, had elements of cronyism. The assets didn't get auctioned off in any kind of fair way. They were sold at cheap prices to insiders. So you got a lot of cronyism in Russia. And that's still a problem, that the Kremlin, Putin and his friends, among what they call oligarchs, who had the privilege of getting resources at low prices, still have a lot of control over the economy. So we have to see whether the Russian public will demand greater liberty, greater freedom from government control of business and media and speech.
Okay, thank you. We also have a couple of questions about going back to the whole monopoly question. Charlotte Chip says, utility is a monopoly. I don't have a choice. I can't buy electric from anyone else. I'm not represented by the PUCO as my electric company is a co-op. Am I not subjected to a monopoly?
Yes, you are. And that is a monopoly protected by statute. Now, if somebody wanted to come in and compete for your service, could they do it? That's the question. In some places, you actually have competing electricity grids, and those cities have lower rates and better service. In some places, the rules have been changed so that people can generate their own power, solar power or wind power, and then sell it to the electricity grid. And so that gives them an additional option compared to just buying it from the traditional utility firm. So those kinds of options are valuable wherever they're possible.
Interesting. And then John Chambers says, I've heard of instances of big companies, big tech being the latest example, of using the capital markets to squelch competing technologies. Does the squelching exist, and does it damage us by reducing our choices? And what do you think can be done about it?
Well, it's the sort of thing where there are always stories about how, I don't know, General Motors bought the technology for an engine that runs on water and they've suppressed it because it would blow up their business model. I think those kind of stories that sound too good to be true have to be taken with a grain of salt. As to specific cases in the tech industry, I have to know more details. Certainly it is possible for a company to try to buy up a technology that they think would put them out of business, but that doesn't stop somebody else from launching that technology. If there are no privileges, if there are no barriers to entry, basically trying to buy your competitors out isn't a profitable strategy. There's research on that showing the problem you have, and the real problem basically is if somebody can produce more cheaply than you, then it's more costly to you to stop them than to just buy shares in their business and try to participate in it.
Okay. And then finally, Robert Spiegler asks, could a flat tax system work in the USA? And if so, do you have any opinion as to what rate would work best?
Well, it certainly could work. All that means is that instead of having graduated income tax brackets, there's a single tax bracket. So everybody pays the same percentage. Typically, it's over some exempted amount. So you don't pay any tax on the first 20,000, and then you pay a certain percentage on everything above that. Or it could be a higher threshold, whatever. It has advantages in that it greatly simplifies the tax code, which means that we waste fewer resources hiring tax attorneys and trying to game the system by investing in tax loopholes and things like that. And so if it were done in a very clean way, I think it probably would be an improvement from the point of view of furthering production for and making the economy more efficient. Probably the most common argument for having multiple tax rates is that the rich ought to be taxed at a higher rate because they can afford a higher rate. But the moral case for that, I think, is pretty weak. The real question, I think, the real burden of government comes from what government spends, because that's what tells you how many resources it's taking out of the economy and consuming. And so I would rather have graduated taxes and a low average tax rate than a flat tax and a high average tax rate.
That's interesting. Well, we are getting near our time, and I wanted to pop back to Janine. Janine, do you have any closing comments or questions that you want to make? And Janine may have had to jump off a couple of minutes early, but we just want to thank you very much for being with us. We have really enjoyed our time with you, Dr. White. And Jewel and Jorn, any closing comments that you all would like to make?
No, just a good show.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for your questions. They're very good, all of you.
Well, thank you. And do we still have Tova?
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. White. I really appreciate you sharing your expertise with us. You know, as one of the world's great economic minds, I really appreciate you helping explain these topics to us. I've really learned a lot.
My pleasure. Thanks for your questions.
Definitely. And we want to invite everyone to join us next week. We're going to have Dr. Ann Bradley of the Fund for American Studies talking about financial communism and some more weaknesses of the communist financial system. And we certainly touched on it today, and we look forward to continuing that discussion next week.
She'll be good.
Yes. Well, thank you again, Dr. White. Thank you to everyone for being with us today and all your great questions. And we will see y'all next week at 2 o'clock Eastern. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.